So how many will be discharged? That's an awful lot. Well, how many new recruits? But that's not quite as many, and they're going to be untrained, too. Well, sorry to ask, but won't that affect national security? Yes, it will. Okay, right. Got it. All right, see ya. June 30th, 1952. The battles of this war, really starting last summer, have often been named after the ridges and hills they've been fought over. Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and this week there's a new such name as the Battle of Old Baldy begins. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the big news was that after 2 years of meticulously avoiding it, the UN began bombing the North Korean hydroelectric complex, which supplies the power to North Korea, mainly civilian use. The first day of bombing was the last day of the week, and it was pretty massive. The first few days of this week, that massive aerial bombing of North Korea's hydroelectric power complex continues, with over 700 fighter-bomber sorties from the UN Air Forces and over 500 from UN Naval Aviation. The Suiho Dam is the fourth largest in the world, and easily the largest in North Korea. And it is badly damaged and put out of service, and 10 other plant complexes are damaged to the point of being unusable. The attacks are not just U.S. Air Force and Navy, actually, but there are also U.S. Marine bombers and those of the South African Air Force involved. Just the Suiho Dam, built by the Japanese in 1941, has a reservoir storage capacity of 20 billion cubic meters and has 6 giant turbines that can produce 100,000 kilowatts of power each, and provides power not only for the western part of North Korea, but also as far into China as Port Arthur. The result of the days of bombing is 90% of North Korea's power production being knocked offline. 11 of 13 power plants totally out of operation. This also knocks out power in a big chunk of northeast China. As of today, there is still a major power blackout in North Korea. China and the Soviets have already sent in technicians across the borders to try and get some of the damage repaired, but it seems as if it will only gradually be restored. As for the international reaction to the operations, in Britain, they draw immediate anger in the press and in the Labour Party, with Clement Attlee charging that UN Commander Mark Clark is risking World War III, though they do not accuse his forces of any territorial violations or object that the plants are non-military targets. Thing is, the British Defense Minister, Lord Alexander, who you may remember from my World War II channel, was just recently in Korea with Clark, and the British are really upset that no one informed him or them of the impending attacks. However, final approval for Clark did not come from above until after the 18th, which is when Alexander left Korea. But still, right? U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson says in London that the U.S. should have consulted the British first. There is no actual obligation to do so, but Acheson says they should have told them about it anyway, just as a courtesy. That means that Winston Churchill's conservative government narrowly survives a Labour motion of censure. Oh yes, it likely would have succeeded had not Acheson publicly taken the blame. Most of the British concerns seem to rest in the fears that the power plant destruction might lead the Chinese to break off the truce negotiations or to attempt retaliation. Clark later stated he was somewhat surprised by the furor the attacks had caused in Britain, but was determined to repeat them whenever profitable until armistice was concluded. And something that may come as a surprise, while at the peace talks in Panmunjom, the communist delegates do complain about the wanton destruction, they do not end the meetings, and they do not, so far anyway, seek revenge. In the US, the reaction is kind of the opposite to that in Britain. The big question that keeps coming up all over Washington is why hadn't the power complexes been bombed earlier? Clark has trouble helping the Joint Chiefs of Staff answer this, since he doesn't really see any reason why it should not have happened earlier. Defense Secretary Robert Lovett will tell a congressman that there are 7 reasons for not having hit them. 1. The post-war reconstruction problem. 2. The knowledge that some of the plants had been dismantled and only recently reconstructed. 3. The storage of excess capacity in the plants. 4. Possible losses of UNC air forces. 5. Use of North Korean power in Manchuria and in the USSR, and possibility that destruction of the plants might invite a communist offensive. 6. Estimated effects upon the armistice talks, and 7. Other priority targets. So there you have it, a new sort of phase in the war in the skies. The war on the ground continues, of course, and the fight for the strategic outpost point known to the UN troops as Old Baldy really heats up this week, starting the 26th. Old Baldy itself sits at the top of a ridge running east-west, and it commands the terrain to the north, south, and west. The Chinese have a position some 300 meters west of the crest, and it has been a nuisance to the U.S. 179th Infantry units in the area. That morning, they vacate their positions so that 8 UN fighter bombers, mortars, and artillery can hit the Chinese without accidentally hitting their own guys. 2 companies then go out and attack after the barrage. The reinforced C Company from the left and F Company from 180th Infantry, just now attached to 179th, from the right. They run smack into the 2 Chinese companies currently defending. They shoot at each other for an hour or so. Then the Chinese withdraw so Chinese mortars can hit the UN troops. Then they come back for close quarters fighting in the trenches. A Company comes up to reinforce as the afternoon rolls on, since C and F cannot push over the crest alone. After some regrouping, C and F hold positions while A works its way around the right flank. It's still anybody's game as dusk approaches. 2 American tanks come up to help out, and even though they're both put out of action, they do help enough that the Chinese slowly vacate their positions, and 179th can send engineers and more tanks up to consolidate the crest. The 3 companies up there spend the night and the next day consolidating, and by the end of the 27th, L Company has arrived to take over the crest. C and A hold the ground to the northwest, which has been taken from the enemy, and F moves back as support. That night sees heavy action. Enemy mortar fires and flares kind of signal that the Chinese are going to attack, and attack they do around 10 p.m. from both northeast and southwest, pushing forward until they meet a ring of defensive fire at the crest. That ring is small arms, automatic weapons, hand grenades, artillery, mortars, and tanks. And the Chinese cannot break it and withdraw around midnight. They try 2 more nighttime attacks very early the morning of the 28th, each about an hour long, and each failing to break the defensive ring. Chinese casualties for the 3 attacks are estimated at around 300. 179th Infantry takes 67, 6 of them killed. The Chinese are not finished for the week, though, and try again the evening of the 28th, heralding the attack with artillery and mortar barrage. It starts off more with enemy recon than attack around 10 p.m., and then the main assault begins an hour later. 2 reinforced battalions hitting L Company from the northeast and northwest. This time, they do penetrate the ring, and the battle degenerates into hand-to-hand combat. Just past midnight, a UN flare plane begins lighting up the area, and that brings into play small arms fire from all 3 U.S. companies on the ridge, and this proves effective. By 1 a.m., the Chinese have withdrawn, losing as many as 700 men in exchange for 43 casualties among the 179th, 8 of them killed. As June ended, the 45th Division, despite the lack of combat experience of many of its troops, had acquitted itself well on the battlefield. In the fight for the outposts, the division had withstood more than 20 Chinese counterattacks and inflicted an estimated 3,500 casualties on the enemy. It had also won a commendation from Van Fleet. That's all well and good, but even smaller scale operations like this, whether offensive or defensive, might be tougher to put together in future, even with the war looking likely to continue for a while. Confusing? Okay. Back in January, the president's budget message foresaw a period of austerity. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had hoped before that American defenses would be built up to what they considered an acceptable level by 1954. But President Harry Truman cut back the funds requested by the services in the budget, so the period of preparedness, I guess you call it, is pushed from 1954 to 1956. This means that the Joint Chiefs feel if the Soviet Union attacks the U.S. full force before 1956, the U.S. capacity to resist would be reduced and compromised. And it's not just the Air Force's desire for 126 modern combat wings of planes that I mentioned some time ago, but the Army, too, would have to tighten its belt. However, a lower budget is a bit deceptive. See, the Korean War costs a lot of money, and the budget is kind of based on it being over by the end of the fiscal year. The war extending beyond today, June 30th, 1952, means supplementary appropriations will be required down the road to deal with shortfalls. U.S. Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins and his staff have had real issues planning their finances because of this. And last month, he asked the Joint Chiefs to put pressure on Secretary of Defense Lovett to at least consider the assumption that the war will continue throughout the entire next fiscal year, maybe with a review each quarter or whatever in case it does end. This week, Lovett agrees that the JCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, can assume the war will continue until at least June 30th, 1953, for purposes of planning for the 1954 fiscal year. Still, the Army estimated they'd need $22.2 billion for the fiscal year 1953, and the President and his budget advisors chopped that down to $14.2 billion, and, spoiler, $2 billion more will be chopped off in July. So, full modern combat readiness for the Army is pushed off until 1956, and plans for expanded production of tanks, artillery, and stuff like that reduced. And Army personnel requirements will have to be rethought and lowered. Lovett thinks the Army has only itself to blame for this. He tells Frank Pace, Secretary of the Army, that whenever congressional committees ask Army personnel why they haven't already obligated the funds they've already been advanced if they need so much stuff so urgently, they never give satisfactory answers. And you know what? He doesn't think they ever will, as long as funds already advanced remain undelegated and just pile up, and they don't ramp up production to turn that money into stuff they can use. He writes in a memo that the excuse of no funds by the Army is tiresomely threadbare. That's not really fair to the Army, of course. The Army hasn't obligated out all the funds voted to it already by Congress because they have to negotiate deals with literally hundreds of companies and factories, and that takes time. In this case, the care and caution exercised by the Army in negotiating contracts rebounded to its disadvantage. Instead of having all the monies deemed necessary on hand at the beginning of the fiscal year, it seemed that the Army would again have to depend upon supplemental appropriations to cover future deficiencies in carrying out the war. But financing the war on a contingency-to-contingency basis is not going to make it easy for the Army to make longer-term programs or plans, is it? I mean, plenty of things the Army wants take 18 months, maybe, or 2 years to get produced, and no one knows how long this limited war is going to continue. They do at least know that demonstrating a concrete need will likely result in money, and that's good, I guess. But beyond equipment, there's also just the men fighting. In terms of manpower, think of this. In 1952, most of the men called up to serve in 1950 will finish their 2 years of duty and can be discharged. Something like 750,000 of them, and they'll need to be replaced with 650,000 or so recruits just in order to train them and get them into service. Will take like a quarter of the Army's manpower. If hostilities did not end shortly, the effective strength of the Army forces in the United States would be limited to 1 airborne division because of the influx of untrained troops. Other divisions would be undermanned and would have to be utilized as replacement and training divisions. To cope with the problem, General Collins urged the Joint Chiefs in June to support his request for an increase of 92,000 men for overhead for the Army. Lovett is trying to get this, but doesn't look good in the face of stiff opposition from the National Security Resources Board and the Budget Bureau. So it seems pretty likely that overall Army personnel is going to shrink over the summer and autumn. They are, of course, building up the South Korean Army, the Rock Army, ROK, month after month, which I'll talk more about soon. And of course, as we've seen over many weeks, they still have big issues with South Korean President Syngman Rhee, who keeps sticking his finger in every pie there is to stick it into and to disturb. This week on the 25th comes a directive from the U.S. State Department, approved by the Joint Chiefs and Truman, for U.S. Ambassador to South Korea John Muccio and Mark Clark. They are supposed to get busy putting together plans for both military and political intervention should Rhee interfere with UN military operations. He's made several threats about for example, withdrawing the ROK divisions from the front lines. Ideally, Truman would order such an intervention, but Clark now has authority to act if it's an emergency. The scenario was outlined along these lines. If Rhee took any actions that threatened the war effort or imposed any further strictures on the National Assembly, Clark and Muccio, on behalf of both the United States and the UN, would demand that he desist. If Rhee refused, Clark would order the ROK Chief of Staff to assume control of the South Korean army and take control of the Pusan area. The authority and function of the ROK government would be preserved insofar as possible, and the Constitution would remain intact. Clark has, in fact, prepared a plan for a coup just in case. In that scenario, Rhee would be invited to Seoul on some pretext, and once he heads there, UN troops would hit the Pusan area, occupy government and communications buildings, and put Rhee's supporters into custody. Rhee would then be forced to declare the end of martial law in the Pusan area, which has been in force for a month now, and allow the National Assembly freedom of action. Should he refuse, he will be squirreled away from the world, and the Prime Minister will issue the proclamation. And there the week ends. With the power out in North Korea for who knows how long, success knocking the Chinese off a ridge near Old Baldy, and plans for a coup in case Syngman Rhee gets even more out of hand. That would be a pretty drastic turn of events, wouldn't it? Launching a coup in a country in the middle of a war to free that democratic country from the guy who's threatening its democracy. But if you lose the war, the invading government would be very oppressive, but the current one is going in that direction ever more, and that's why you might have to launch the coup. Also, you don't have enough money to put together the force needed to actually win the war. Also, you've knocked out the power in the country you're fighting against, which mostly affects their civilians. Though you're fighting the war to free those civilians from their nasty government, which is a nasty government to be sure, but it mostly keeps their lights on. And I should point out that this week, the Korean War is 2 years old. Really is. This limited war turns 2 this week on the 25th. Well, to find out where this all leads, come back right here each and every week, and I will tell you what happened that week. And I can do this thanks to the Time Ghost Army. It is the army that very much keeps our lights on. Brian Palin is the Army Member of the Week here. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.